Alright guys, this video is meant to be an introduction to the gastrointestinal or digestive system. And the way that I want to do this is introduce the organs that are present in the system, because there are a lot of them, and then we're going to move on to an overview of how the system is controlled. So remember, we've got sort of two different sets of organs. The first is the actual GI tract itself. So everything starting in the mouth and moving food down through the pharynx into the esophagus, from the esophagus into the stomach, from the stomach into the small intestine, right, and all of its different divisions, and then eventually from the small intestine into the large intestine with its subcomponents and divisions. All of those things together constitute the actual GI tract. And in addition to that, we have a bunch of accessory organs that are critical for digestion, but they're not actually part of the flow of food. And so salivary glands in the mouth would fit that category. The liver that secretes bile into the small intestine via the gallbladder, those also count. And the pancreas is another accessory organ. So these are organs that are secreting fluids that contain enzymes and molecules that are necessary for digestion, but those organs aren't ever directly exposed to food themselves. And so the first place that I want to go with this is talking about regulation of GI tract. And this term alimentary canal really just means the actual GI tract tube itself. So esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine. If you go into any of those organs, this is the general structure that you're going to see. And so this picture doesn't really represent any one of those organs specifically, but everywhere you look, you're going to see these layers. So if this is the lumen, right, the interior where you would actually find food present in the GI tract. Remember from A&P 1 earlier on, epithelium just means the layer of cells directly touching an open space or a lumen. And so the epithelial tissue right inside that GI tract, that's where we expect absorption to actually happen, especially if we're in the intestines. Also where secretion happens. So this is movement of mucus and digestive enzymes into the GI tract, and eventually absorption of nutrients out of the GI tract and into the blood. Right? That epithelial tissue, along with a layer of connective tissue that you call the lamina propria, and a pretty thin layer of smooth muscle called muscularis mucosa, those things together make up the mucosal layer. That's the innermost layer of tissue. Right underneath that is this submucosa, right? Sub meaning under the mucosa. And that's another layer of connective tissue where you also find exocrine glands that are secreting like acid and mucus and things like that in the stomach and small intestine. And you're also going to find a lot of blood vessels and nerves. And the nerves are a big part of what's going on here. So pay attention to two different clusters of nerves. A cluster or a network of nerves we call a plexus. And so the nerves in the submucosal layer, easy enough, are the submucosal plexus. That is how your nervous system turns on secretion of things like stomach acid and mucus and digestive enzymes from the GI tract. And then you also have a very thick layer, a relatively thick layer of smooth muscle outside of the mucosa. That's called the muscularis layer, or sometimes muscularis externa. This is where you find the muscles that are actually propelling food through the GI tract by peristalsis. And these nerves that you find in the muscle layer, they constitute the myenteric plexus. Remember the term, or the prefix mya or myo always means muscle. And so that's how your nervous system is making muscles contract. Right? Outside of that, the serosa is really just a layer of connective tissue. It's fairly boring. That's just forming the external border that separates the GI tract from its other surrounding organs. Okay. So pulling all of this neuro stuff together a little bit, remember the autonomic nervous system regulates involuntary motor control of organs, and specifically the parasympathetic division. Remember, that's your rest and digest part of the nervous system. This is the set of nerves that are connecting from the brain to the GI tract. And so if you consider this to represent the CNS, right, brain and spinal cord, you would expect parasympathetic nerves to be forming synapses both in the submucosal plexus, right, and in the myenteric plexus. And the neurotransmitter of choice here is acetylcholine. You might remember acetylcholine from the neuromuscular junction in skeletal muscle. It's the same neurotransmitter here, but it's binding a different set of receptors. These acetylcholine receptors are called muscarinics. Right? Those muscarinic receptors all over the GI tract are generally stimulatory as far as digestive function when we release acetylcholine. So this is one way that we can turn on activity of the GI tract, is by releasing acetylcholine through these parasympathetic nerves. All right. The other thing that can happen is you can have local activation. And one way that you can have local activation is that these nerve plexuses, they have their own reflexes. So example, if you swallow food and your stomach begins to stretch, there are stretch receptors in the wall of the stomach that will trigger these short reflexes within the myenteric plexus. So the stomach or the small intestine will reflexively start contracting even without input from the CNS. Right? The last option is you can also use endocrine secretions. So there are hormones, the most important one for the stomach being gastrin, where those hormones are released into the blood and bind receptors, right, either in this mucosal tissue to stimulate secretion, or in the muscularis externa to stimulate muscle contractions. So between your three options, parasympathetic activity from the brain, local nerve reflexes from mechanoreceptors, or the response to hormones that are released into the blood, all of these things are going to activate GI tissue. Right? Most of that's happening in the stomach, but you also have functions and secretions that are going on in the small and large intestine, and they need to be able to respond as well. All right, so I hope this introduction sort of set the stage for where we're going next. And in the upcoming videos, we're going to look at individual organs, stomach and small intestine, large intestine, liver, etc., and get into the details of what's going on in each of those. So follow along in the playlist. The videos go in order, and they'll make the most sense that way.